Exciting things are happening today. We've been using our VIAIR portable compressor, the 300P. It's been working great for us. No problems whatsoever, but we've been sheltering in place for the last 2 months. And as you know, when there's not a whole lot to do, you sort of make your own projects. So that's exactly what I've done. And now we're going to have an onboard compressor under the engine bay mounted to this sweet van compass bracket. And we're going to have a 2-gallon air tank with hookups in the front and the back of the van. Apologies in advance if the video is a little jumpy because I'm going to be figuring stuff out on the way, but I'll make sure to have a full parts list in the Amazon description, so if you want to replicate this yourself, hopefully the end result will be somewhat easy to follow. First things first is getting the van compass air compressor mount installed in the engine bay. The 3 mounting points to screw the mount in are open holes that we're going to have to install nutserts in with a rivet gun. The manual that I got from Van Compass specified a spot in the back there, a hole along with a hole on the side, and then a hole on the front part, kind of on top of the ECU. But this mount actually has its 3rd point is not actually along the firewall, it's actually down here, and we're not going to need to put a nutsert in there. So basically, use a rivet gun to put in 2 riv nuts on the side. I had to clean up this area a little bit because I had my wiring for my winch and all my lighting as well as a fuse block. So do what you got to do in order to make room for the mount. I also had to move this out of the way, this bunch of wires. So whatever you need to do in order to clear a little bit of room for the mount. Here's our rivet gun. I have a Astro pneumatic tool at home, which I think is a little bit higher quality, but that doesn't help me out here. So I bought pretty much the cheapest thing on Amazon that looked like it wouldn't fall apart on the first use. So we're going to use the M8 attachment for the rivets in the engine bay. Another thing I forgot to mention before I go ahead and show you how to use the rivet gun is if your van came with an auxiliary battery, you're going to have more steps because you're going to have to remove both the battery and the bracket, as well as figuring out how to relocate the battery to a different location. Before we're able to install the nutserts, we're going to have to go ahead and enlarge this hole. The Van Compass install guide said that a 17/32 drill bit should be used if you need to widen the hole, which in our case we have to because the nutsert's not going to fit through. Now that we've widened the hole, you can see the riv nut fits in nicely. So we're going to go ahead and grab our rivet gun. We've got our rivet gun with the M8 tip installed already. Everything's snugged up, so we're just going to go ahead and take the rivet nut and thread it onto this end piece. The rivet nut's on, so we're going to go ahead and install the riv nut. The riv nut's in the van, so we're just going to go ahead and squeeze the levers until the nutsert's installed. In order to access this front hole, both for the purposes of drilling out the hole to widen it and also to be able to fit the rivet gun, I popped the ECU out. It's pretty easy. I took the bolt off or the nut off from here, but I don't think that was necessary. There's a tab over here and a tab over here, and once you release those, you can sort of slide the thing out because it's got these tabs in the front that sort of hold that side down to this mount. So basically just tie this thing back here and then you'll be able to do the work with this hole. We have the 2 nutserts installed. You can see here's the one in the front and then the one in the back. So it's time to mount the Van Compass air compressor mount. Drop the ECU back in place and then we'll be ready to put the mount in. One last thing before putting the mount in, Van Compass in their install guide recommends popping out the plug or the mount that's holding this wiring into this metal frame and then just routing it in between the washer fluid reservoir tank and this metal bracket. The air mount is actually getting attached to this hole, and at least to me it seemed like the mount wasn't interfering with this wiring, but I figure might as well just follow the advice of the experts and remove this plug. So I don't have an automotive trim tool, so I'm just gonna use this guy, but ideally automotive trim tool to pop this out and then just tuck it underneath this metal bracket. Now that we've gotten the wiring out of the way, we're gonna use the hardware that came with the van compass mount. So we've got going into those 2 riv nuts that we installed. We're going to use these 2 bolts with the washers. And then the third mounting point, which is down here, that hole, we're going to run a bolt and a washer through on the top and then the nut on the underside. And for now, we're just going to hand tighten because we're going to want to make sure the mount is level before we fully tighten all the fasteners. Now that we've got the mount in, you can use a level to make sure that it's as flat as you can get it. Now that we've got the mount level, we're going to go ahead and tighten down all the bolts. Before mounting the compressor and the tank to the van compass mount, I decided that I wanted to run all the wiring and the air hose for the gauge, just because once I get the tank in place, I'm not going to have a whole lot of room to work around. And I'm pretty sure the tank is going to mostly block the grommet that I'm going to use to pass the wiring through. So I decided on this plastic piece to put the pressure gauge, and I decided to relocate on the Revel, on an older Revel at least, we have a battery boost switch, so I decided to relocate that to one of the blanks. And then I also cut a hole in another blank to put the on-off switch for the air compressor. So just do what you got to do for the switch. I decided not to use the gauge and the switch mount that came with the VIAIR kit, but whatever you want to do here is up to you. Now that I have the switches mounted, I'm running the air line and the wiring for the switch. The air line's a lot easier to work with if you straighten it out with a heat gun. Here's the line right here, and I have it running behind the dash through this lower of the 2 grommets through the firewall, and then that is going to get plumbed to the air tank. Now that we have the air line for the dash gauge through the firewall, it's time to run power. So one of the terminals on the back of the switch for the air compressor is going to go straight to the battery, which in my case I've got a fuse block in the engine bay, so that's what I'm going to use. And the ring terminal that was on, or that came with the kit in the onboard hookup kit, was not big enough for my terminal, so I just replaced the ring terminal, but you might be fine with what came in the kit. And the manual says to leave the end with the fuse on the side that connects to the battery and runs from the battery to the switch. The fuse was not actually installed in mine, so make sure you don't think that the one that comes in the kit is a spare. So go ahead and install that, and then you're ready to run the line to the switch. I'm going to feed this side with a terminal through the firewall, and then we'll determine where to cut the line so that we'll have just enough room for the wire to reach the switch. One thing I didn't consider is that the fuse is not actually going to fit through the grommet, so I just ran it out of this hole. Then we're going to measure and cut, and then we're going to feed the end that connects to the back of the switch from the engine bay through the firewall into the cabin rather than the other way around. Now that we have the power source wire for the switch cut to the right size, go ahead and connect this yellow connector to the end of the wire. Now that our connector is crimped onto the end of the wire, go ahead and pull it out through the engine bay and re-feed it through the grommet. Now that we've run our source line to the switch through the firewall, it's time to go ahead and do the return wire from the switch. I actually decided that I wanted to run the power for the bulb for the pressure gauge that I've mounted lower down on the dash. I decided that I want to run the power to this return wire for the switch so that the backlighting comes on whenever the compressor is on, rather than trying to find a switched wire for the lights somewhere in the dash. So I'm using one of these Winnebago 3-port connectors, so I'm going to run the return wire from the switch through one of these and then continue it through the second port, and then the third port is where I'm going to tap into the power to use for that backlighting of the gauge. Here's our return wire on the back of the switch. I ran it down through here, and I'm going to cut it right here so that I can have that 3-port connector right here for easy access for the gauge. Winnebago connector's ready to go, so I'm actually going to take the remaining wire and feed it through the grommet from the engine bay side. Here's our return wire going through the grommet, and we'll cut this to basically be able to plug into the relay on the side that says connect to trigger switch. Here's our wire that we just passed through the grommet. This is the one that's going to get tied into the relay, and we can just go ahead and hook it up through this Winnebago switch. Now we're ready to put the trim piece back on that's holding the gauge. We're going to run this to the back of the gauge, it's the air line, and then the power wire for the bulb we're going to run into this 3rd port and then just ground the black wire. Just to aid with getting the air line over the fitting on the back of the pressure gauge, I'm just going to heat up the air line, the tip of the air line, with this heat gun. Air line's on, so just after screwing on the nut to hold the air line in place, we're ready to put this trim piece back on the dashboard. Now it's time to attach the fittings to the air tank. We're going to do the 1/4 male to male right here on the top, and that's what we're going to put this female T, this one, in the top, so that we're going to have the air compressor line coming in to one side, and then the other side we're going to use the reducer to attach the relay. And then in the back of the tank, this is the side that's going to go up against the firewall. On this one, I'm going to use the pressure relief valve, and then on this side we're just going to put the plug in, one of the plugs that came in this VIAIR kit. And then in the bottom we're going to install the drain cock. Make sure to use some form of thread seal on the threads of your fittings. The first of the 2 fittings picked up from Home Depot is this 90-degree elbow. This will basically make it so that we can have the air line coming down and out from the tank as opposed to coming straight out, because that'll help clear the grill. The second of the Home Depot fittings is this male-to-male brass nipple. That'll allow us to connect the female T at the top. Now that we've got the female T on the top of the tank, we're going to connect on the right side the pressure switch relay using the reducer that came in our VIAIR fittings kit. Here's the reducer on our pressure switch, so we're just going to thread that onto the T. Now that we have our pressure switch on the T fitting, I'm going to go ahead and take this compression fitting and screw it onto the bottom of this elbow. Before installing the air tank in the engine bay, install the rubber isolators. Van Compass's blog recommended dousing the rubber isolators in Windex, which was a great recommendation, otherwise it would have been a torturous experience. I also used a flathead screwdriver to help coax the rubber isolators in place through the holes. Before placing the air tank in the van, install the brass inserts through the rubber isolators. This step is a lot easier when the tank isn't already in the van. I'm installing the air compressor on the Van Compass mount before the air tank, just because I think it'll be easier to work with before getting the tank on. If you want, you can install the air filter remotely, but I decided to just install it right on the air compressor. So here it is right here. I'm going to remove this bracket and then just remove the plug and screw it on. Now that we have our compressor sitting on the mount, we're going to run a bolt and washer through the top, and then through the bottom it's going to go washer, lock washer, and nut. Final step before working on the air tank is to ground the black wire coming out of the compressor. The red wire is going to be plugged into the relay that's attached to the tank. Now that we have the air tank sitting on the mount, go ahead and put some thread sealant on the leader hose for the air compressor and screw it into the T fitting on the air tank. Before securing the tank to the Van Compass mount, we're going to go and run the wipers just to make sure that the wiper linkage clears both the relay and the female T that's on the top of the air tank. Run the 4 bolts through the feet of the air tank just so that it's in the right position. Now that we have the bolts through the air tank, run your wipers to make sure that the wiper linkage clears your relay. It's a little close here, so I'm going to tighten this T fitting a little bit. The new location looks good, so we can finish attaching the air tank. Tightening the fasteners for the air tank was a bit of a pain, but I'll say what helped me a lot was using this ratcheting wrench underneath to tighten the nut and then holding the bolt in place from the top using this little pivoting adapter for a socket wrench bit. Final step with our wiring is to just connect the relay to everything. So we've got the black wire coming out of the relay, that's the ground, so ground that. White wire, it's all labeled, but white wire is to connect to the load. So in this case it's the power wire for the compressor, so we got that hooked up. And then final two connections. This connects to positive fuse power, so I'm going to run that to my fuse block. And then the final is to connect to the trigger switch. So that's our wire that we have running out of the firewall that we ran earlier. So we're just going to cut that to size and then connect it to this terminal. Now that all the wiring is done, I'm going to go ahead and connect the air line that runs to the in-cab gauge to one of these fittings. So remove the collar, slide it onto the hose, and then we are going to connect it here. So I'm just going to hit the tip of it with a heat gun just to make it easier to fit over the barb. Now that we've tightened the collar on the line that's running the gauge, we'll use the remaining two compression fittings to run the line to the front of the van and an air line to the rear of the van. Next step on the install is to figure out where you're going to put your front and rear air hookups. Maybe I'm brave, maybe I'm an idiot, but I'm going to drill a hole through my backwoods bumper and run it out to the right of the license plate. So here's my quick connect fitting with a cap, and I'm just going to have it go right here. I've measured 5 times, so now I'm going to cut once. Now that I've drilled a 3/4 inch hole in the front bumper, which wasn't scary at all, it's going to be time to assemble the quick connect fitting that goes into the front and connect it to the air line that's going to run to the air tank. I think it's going to be easiest to assemble everything here before installing that bulkhead fitting on the front bumper. So basically just going to assemble everything in the order that you see right here, and then I'm going to run the other end of the air line through the hole first. And then I'm going to go ahead and screw this nut onto the back of the bulkhead fitting, and then all we'll have to do is connect the other end of the air line to the air tank after cutting it to fit. We have everything connected that we need for our front quick connect port, so we're just going to go ahead and feed the air line through the hole. The lock ring and nut, basically we're just going to hold that at the back of the hole and then feed the air line through that. Now that we've fed the air line through the hole in the bumper, go ahead and tighten the nut on the back of the bulkhead fitting. We've got our front quick connect all done. So final step is to put the dust cap on. Dust cap is on, so it is time to go find the other end of the air line and connect it to the air tank. Here's our air line coming from the front bumper. I'm going to go ahead and attach it to this port on the right. So cut the air line to fit and then attach to this compression fitting. Now that the air line to our front quick connect port is all hooked up, it's time to go to the back of the van. Now that the front end of the van is done, it's time to go to the back. I made a bracket out of flat aluminum bar for my rear quick connect setup, which is pretty easy. Basically just cut these 2 tabs off sort of for aesthetic purposes, 3/4 inch hole, 2 screws in the back, which I'll show you where that goes in the van, but basically that'll allow me to mount this right next to the hitch. There are companies that make these brackets if you don't feel like making one yourself. I think you could potentially get one from Agile, and I know there are numerous other companies that make similar brackets. This is roughly what a standard connection would look like. I accidentally ordered a female quick connect coupler instead of a male, so I just have this brass nipple in there, but basically got the quick connect fitting here, the bulkhead fitting going through the bracket, and then I'm using this brass elbow to route the line going up because that'll be easier to send the air line directly to basically the base of the floor of the van so that it's kind of tucked out of the way and I don't have a risk of snagging it on a rock or a branch or whatever. Mine is going to look a little different because I've got the elbow here, but then instead of putting the compression fitting straight into the top, I'm going to use a T to give me another port because I'm using air for more than one purpose in the back of the van. Now that we have our fittings ready to go, it's time to grab the 20 feet of air hose from the onboard air hookup kit. Again, it's going to be helpful to hit it with a heat gun just to make it easier to work with. Now that we've straightened out our airline with the heat gun, I'm going to go ahead and hit the tip of this airline with the heat gun just so that it fits over the barb on this compression fitting a little easier. Now that the airline is attached to the compression fitting, I'm going to go ahead and attach everything through the mount with the bulkhead fitting. Bulkhead fitting is mounted to the bracket, so go ahead and screw on the other side. Now that we have our bracket fully assembled, it's time to go to the van and mount it to the back. Alright, so we are at the back of the van now. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see, but I got the bracket mounted up here. Basically just put these two screws through this back sort of pinch point on the frame. So I'll give you another look from the other side. But basically what we're going to do is to back out a little bit. Here's the spare. We are going to find a way to route the airline to the front of the van. I'm probably going to trace whatever wiring this is. Here's another look from the back. Bracket's hanging down right here next to the hitch. And so now it's time to do the fun job of routing the airline to the front of the van. That was certainly not the most enjoyable thing I've ever done, but end result is we have got our airline from the back right here. So we're going to go ahead and hook it up to this compression fitting. Airline going to the rear is all hooked up to this compression fitting. So now we're going to go ahead and turn on the compressor and make sure that we're building pressure. Alright, moment of truth. Flip the compressor on. It's on. Here's a gauge. Building pressure, that's good. Hopefully we don't have leaks everywhere. And this relay, I believe, cuts off at 105 psi. Alright, getting closer. I think 105 is the cutoff. Basically, once the compressor cuts off, we're going to go walk around and make sure that we don't have any leaks at any of the fittings. Alright, compressor shut off. I had a leak at my front quick connect fitting, so I just went ahead and tightened that down, and it appears to not be leaking anymore. And we are sitting pretty at 105, so I'm going to call this good to go. I've gotten to use our onboard air setup for about a week now, and I have to say that I'm really loving it, but I figure I'll give it a couple weeks of use and then do a review video just so that I have a little bit more use under my belt so that I can offer some good opinions on it and also provide some numbers on the amount of time it takes to fill the tires versus our old portable compressor. But I'd just like to finish off the video by showing how I'm currently inflating both the tires on the van and also our bike tires. So this thing right here is sort of a homemade setup that's got a pressure regulator with a quick connect fitting that hooks into the quick connect coupler on either the front or the rear of the van. And then I've got an air pressure regulator that basically I can set to whatever pressure I want in the tires. So for the front, I might set it for 60 psi. And then it'll stop letting out air at around 60 psi. Little shutoff valve, and then a T where I have air hose that goes to one tire and then air hose that goes to the other tire. So I can do two tires at once, and that way I end up with equal tire pressure on both sides of the van, and then got two tire chucks on the end. And I'll link to all the parts that I use to make this in the description. Here it is on the front quick connect, so you can see I've got one line going to the front passenger tire, and then one line going to the front driver's side. Nice and easy. And then over here, this is what we use to inflate the bike tires. Basically just a 6-foot air hose with a quick connect on either side. And then I have this press deflator. So it just works as a standard air gun, but on the end of it, I've got a connection for both a Presta and a Schrader valve. And then I have a pressure gauge right here, and then this button right here releases pressure if I've gone over. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this video is easy to follow. If you want me to clarify anything, just let me know below in the comments.